Hello again, 122. There are two things that I need to go over before I get into the main topic of this video. Number one, in the last conclusion of the political evolution, I forgot to mention at the end of the video that there's been normalization talks between Serbia and Kosovo since the beginning of 2018. So there is some light at the end of the tunnel in that situation. Secondly, the political change that has occurred in Cuba in 2015 is the normalization of diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba after nearly half a century of no diplomatic relations at all. Raul Castro and President Obama have embassies open once again in both countries. And Miguel Diaz-Canel is expected to replace Raul Castro in April 2018, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens there, as the Cubans will be governed by somebody other than one of the Castros for the first time since the revolution in 1959. Now, to the main topic of this, to conclude chapter 28, is we're going to summarize how the Western world, led by the United States, has responded to Islamic fundamentalism and to terrorism, and what is the policy towards the growth of terrorism, which has been one of the big stories of the late 20th century and the 21st century. And during the late 1970s and early 1980s, small bands of terrorists used assassination, indiscriminate killing of civilians, the taking of hostages, and the hijacking of airplanes to draw attention to their demands or to destabilize governments in the hope of achieving their political goals. My first remembrance of a terrorist act was at the 1972 Munich Olympic Summer Games in West Germany, when Palestinians the Black September group took 11 Israeli athletes hostage out of the Olympic Village, and in the attempt to meet the terrorist demands, they were escorted to the airport, where the West German police opened fire on all of the terrorists and the athletes, and all were killed at the airport. And motivations for terrorist acts have varied considerably. Left and right-wing terrorist groups flourished in the late 1970s and early 1980s. There were the Red Brigades in Italy, who kidnapped the former Prime Minister Aldo Moro, and they ended up killing the guy. And in both Germanys at the time, you had the Baader Meinhof gang that was engaged in many terrorist acts. But terrorist acts also stemmed from militant nationalists who wished to create a separate state. And most prominent was the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, which resorted to vicious attacks against the ruling government and innocent civilians in Northern Ireland, because that's part of the UK. It's British-controlled Northern Ireland, whereas the Republic of Ireland is independent. But Northern Ireland is still part of the UK today, and the attacks just died off. And although left and right-wing terrorist activities declined in Europe in the 80s, international terrorism continued. And angered by the loss of their territory to Israel, some militant Palestinians responded not only at the Olympic Games, but with other terrorist attacks against Israel's supporters. Palestinian terrorists mounted attacks on both European and American tourists in Europe, including attacks on vacationers at airports in Rome and Vienna in 1985. State-sponsored terrorism was often an integral part of international terrorism. Militant governments, especially in Iran, Libya, and Syria, assisted terrorist organizations that carried out attacks on Europeans and Americans. And on December 21st, 1988, Pan American Flight 103 from Frankfurt to New York exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing all 259 passengers and crew members. And the bomb responsible for the explosion had been planted by 2 Libyan terrorists. Muammar Gaddafi has been ousted from power in 2011, and Libya has calmed way down since the days of the dictatorship of Gaddafi. And then there was the terrorist attack on the United States. One of the most destructive acts of terrorism occurred on September 11, 2001 in the United States. Terrorists hijacked 4 commercial jet airplanes after takeoff from Boston, Newark, and Washington, D.C. The hijackers flew 2 of the airplanes into the towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, causing these buildings as well as several surrounding buildings to collapse. A 3rd hijacked plane slammed into the Pentagon near Washington, D.C. The 4th plane, apparently headed for Washington, crashed after passengers heroically struggled with the hijackers for control of the plane, and it went out of control and it crashed in an isolated area of Pennsylvania. In total, more than 3,000 people were killed. And these coordinated acts of terror were carried out by hijackers connected to the international terrorist organization known as Al-Qaeda, run by Osama bin Laden, who was killed by Navy SEAL Team 6 in 2011 hiding out in Pakistan. A native of Saudi Arabia of Yemeni extraction, bin Laden used an inherited fortune to set up terrorist training camps in Afghanistan under the protection of that nation's militant fundamentalist Islamic rulers known as the Taliban. U.S. President George Walker Bush vowed to wage a war on terrorism and work to create a coalition of nations to assist in ridding the world of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. The Bush Doctrine is the policy of the United States still today in 2018. It is the idea of preemption. Hit them before they hit you. And within weeks of the attack on America, United States and NATO air forces began bombing Taliban-controlled command centers and Al-Qaeda hiding places in Afghanistan. On the ground, Afghan forces assisted by U.S. Special Forces pushed the Taliban out and gained control of the country by the end of 2001. A democratic, multi-ethnic government was installed, but it continues to face problems from revived Taliban activity as they hide out in the mountains in isolated parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. So the response is the war on terror, the Bush Doctrine, the idea of preemption. And that ends chapter 28 for our purposes. There's no more United States stuff to do in this chapter other than the definitions you do that you post to the forum.